Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Forward Physio. The goal of today's podcast is to update or change how we think about pain. And I'm very, very fortunate, and we're all fortunate, that I'm sitting here with, I think, the person that is perhaps one of the best people to help us with that goal. So I'm here with Dr. Peter Stillwell. And Peter, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invite. I think I disagree with some of the things you said already. I'm not sure. How much I can offer of value, but I appreciate the invite and yeah, happy to talk. And so thank you. Yeah.
It's my pleasure, and I think you're being modest because I've read your papers and they've changed how I think about things for sure. So hopefully we could get some of those points across today. So before we dive into everything related to pain and sort of how we think about pain, can you just give everyone a little bit of an introduction into who you are and what you do professionally?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I change how I describe myself on a weekly basis. Today, I'll call myself a pain researcher, but I also sometimes do other research on health-related topics. I'm Canadian, but I currently live in Denmark, so I'm close to Copenhagen. I'm here doing research at the University of Southern Denmark, but I'm also affiliated with McGill University in Canada, so continuing to work with researchers in Canada. Yeah, I like learning, I guess. So I did a bunch of degrees, all in Canada. So did a Bachelor of Kinesiology degree at the University of Calgary. I did a Doctor of Chiropractic degree in Toronto, did a Master's of Science in Rehabilitation Research in Physiotherapy at Dalhousie, so on the East Coast, and then straight through to a PhD in health, which was also at Dalhousie. And yeah, I guess like a lot of my research is focused on how we can conceptualize pain. So I work a lot with theory, which can get quite abstract at times, and because we're often engaging in quite philosophical kind of academic debates. But I also do some more pragmatic, kind of clinically relevant work as well. So I try to do a little bit of a mixture of things. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's the basic stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, the research is quite philosophical, and I enjoy it. It's nice to take a step back from some of the papers that are just very, very, I guess, for lack of a better term, sciency. Yours is, I find, like easier to read and quite interesting. So I appreciate the more like sort of knowledge or philosophical approach to that.
Well, thanks. Yeah, and it's like people seem to be like at least clinicians seem to be more gravitated towards some of the philosophy papers I write, and then a lot of the philosophers are gravitated towards more clinically oriented papers. And I'm like, no, it should be the opposite. But whatever. If I get 2, 3 readers, I'm good. Yeah,
I guess we're interested in the things that we're just not always constantly exposed to.
maybe that's it. Yeah, it's a bit
Maybe.
different. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I think in order to sort of get us started in just understanding these concepts that you teach, sort of this enactive approach to pain, I think it makes sense to start off with just getting a good grip on what pain actually is and differentiating that between what we call nociception. So, can you sort of differentiate those two terms for us?
Yeah, yeah. I really like that starting point, and I guess like people have defined pain and nociception in a variety of ways over the years. I tend to mostly rely on IASP, so International Association for the Study of Pain, and I think most pain researchers or people kind of working dedicated to the field of pain tend to gravitate towards that IASP. So they have a taxonomy of definitions of pain related terms, and they do provide definitions for terms like pain, nociception, but a variety of other terms. And I guess really kind of basic stuff is that pain is this kind of like unpleasant sensory and emotional experience. And they're quite particular with that word experience, and I think that is key. So that means that it is personal or subjective. It's unique to each person. And The difference compared to nociception is more the nervous system activity. So as you know, we have all these receptors in our body, and they can be activated by stimuli that is damaging, so damaging to the tissues, or potentially damaging. So activation of those receptors can create these neural signals. So the interesting thing is that pain and nociception are related, but it's not like this like neat linear relationship. It's not like this perfect one-to-one relationship. And that's where things get, I think, really interesting, but also kind of tricky. So for example, you can have like really high amounts of nociception or high amounts of tissue damage, yet little to no pain. And so I'm sure you're well aware of this, and most people are well aware of this, is like classic examples in the pain literature are like war, where people just have like these like catastrophic injuries, yet at that time report very little or even no pain. Or physiotherapists may be more inclined to like sports, that type of stuff. So examples where people are at a sporting event, an athlete injures themselves, there's a ton of tissue damage, yet in those moments, like report little to no pain. So there's this discrepancy between tissue damage and pain. But it doesn't stop there. We can flip it and do the opposite. So it's like no clear nociception, no clear tissue damage, but like lots of pain, extreme amounts of pain. So the most classic examples in the pain literature are like phantom limb pain. And I'm not just talking like phantom limb pain, like post amputation. Like it's people born like congenitally absent limbs, like they didn't have it in the first place, going on to have phantom limb pain. So it's like there isn't a clear nociceptive driver peripherally. There isn't some sort of clear tissue damage. The limb isn't even there, yet they can experience pain. So examples like that show that difference between nociception or tissue damage and pain, which I find super interesting and clinically important as well. Yeah.
It's fantastic. I think when I was first getting into physio school, when these concepts were first being introduced to me, that's when I started to think a little bit deeper about pain. But I think the average person tends to think of pain as a sense, more so, I guess, along with how we conceptualize nociception. There's an input, and then we experience pain, it's an output, and it's just a very simple process like that. But I think those two examples, or those few examples that you brought up, how sometimes there could be lots of nociception but maybe not experiencing a lot of pain, or maybe the absence of nociception, like an amputee or even someone born without a limb, experiencing pain in a limb that isn't even there. And I think these concepts sort of open the doors into, I guess, this more philosophical approach in how we discuss pain, because it's not that clear cut. And here's an input, here's our output.
I wish it was that simple. It'd make everybody's lives a lot easier, but yeah, a bit more complex. Yeah,
it would. So how did we first start to conceptualize pain? What were some of the earlier models, historically speaking, that we used to try and rely on to sort of describe pain and understand it?
Yeah, I guess I could take this a variety of different ways. Probably the most useful way to kind of like, or as a starting point, is kind of think more of like the biomedical kind of traditional model. So that's historically been quite dominant and arguably still is the main kind of model in healthcare and pain research still today. So I think it's important to touch on that. So I guess as the name kind of suggests, we focus on biology. So trying to find the source of nociception, trying to find the tissue damage to try to explain pain. So thinking of it as like this kind of like more linear kind of mechanical approach. If you have pain, you must be able to find some sort of source. But as I noted earlier, I guess it gets tricky though, because that relationship between tissue damage and pain is quite variable. And there's so many examples where people have pain, especially chronic pain, without a clear nociception, without clear identifiable tissue damage. Classic example is like most cases of low back pain. We can't just pinpoint one single thing, at least with confidence, to kind of hang our hat on. And so with that, comes a variety of of challenges or pitfalls if we just rely on that kind of biomedical model. Yeah.
Yeah, I do find that it tends to be very pervasive still. That patients are always looking for like the root cause of their pain. And it's, I guess, another way to talk about the biomedical model is it's pretty reductionist. It's that we find this one source and everything has sort of a cause and an outcome because of it, right? But there's clearly issues with that. Um, so I think that's good to touch on. And then from the biomedical model, we moved more so I think into the biopsychosocial model. Could you explain what that is? And eventually we'll talk about the actual pitfalls of that as well, which I think is fascinating because although the biomedical model is perhaps a little bit more dominant these days, we're starting to shift into the biopsychosocial model. And I think a lot of people think about it as this perfect model that doesn't have its pitfalls, but I think you would point out otherwise, right?
Yeah, and I guess like going back to that biomedical model, like I think a lot of people have been, I guess, stigmatized or not believed when there wasn't this kind of clear biological source of their pain, and so that biomedical model has been critiqued because it downplays or overlooks those psychological and social factors, and I guess even when people do talk about those psychological factors, it's almost like dismissive. It's like, oh, well, we can't find pain in the body, so it must just be all in your mind or all in your head or psychological for some reason. And so some of those issues like led to the development of that biopsychosocial model. So yeah, really getting popular now. People are talking about it, but then I'll often ask people like, what does it mean? Like how would you define it or how would you describe it? And then people kind of give me this like blank look and they're like, it's the thing we should be doing, but I can't quite tell you what it is. So some of my research was like, because I didn't know either. I was just like, I'm like, I probably should know if I'm in healthcare, if I'm a pain researcher. And so some of my PhD work was like just diving deep into the model and like into the biopsychosocial model, into some of the history. And I guess most people would say it's like was formally proposed by George Engel. He was like a famous physician, famous researcher. He proposed this landmark paper introducing the biopsychosocial model in 1977. And it really just started with his frustrations. He's like, oh, this biomedical model is just like neglecting these other really important factors, the social factors, the psychological factors. And so his biopsychosocial model, as the name suggests, starts to bring these other factors into the conversation. And some of the, I guess going into maybe some of the leading towards some of the issues that we see with it is that it is quite vague and kind of clunky at times. And people haven't really quite made sense of how to interpret it. So there's been a variety of these different interpretations. And we've written a little bit about that, including a paper not too long ago. It was in Physiotherapy Theory and Practice. So it was with Ben Cormack, myself, philosopher Sabrina Konings, and Joe Gibson. So we talk about how one of the most common kind of interpretations is that biological, psychological, and social factors shape illness and health. So people apply this to pain and they're like, okay, well, yeah, biopsychosocial factors shape the experience. And we can give people a questionnaire, for example, or verbally ask them about these different factors. And a lot of people would say that's a biopsychosocial approach. But another, I guess, important interpretation, I think a less dominant interpretation, is the kind of caring and the humanistic feature of the biopsychosocial model. So that was something that was quite prominent in George Engel's writings. So emphasizing the importance of the clinician-patient relationship. It's not just about giving them a questionnaire about different factors or asking about these different factors. It's about building trust. It's about mutual respect, that type of stuff. So we've been talking about, those being some of the prominent interpretations of that model. And then we've been getting into also written about some critiques as well. Yeah.
That paper with Ben Cormack and Joe Gibson, who is the other author?
Sabrina Konings. She's a philosopher. Yeah.
Right. Don't want to leave her out as well.
Yeah.
That one's called the biopsychosocial model is lost in translation, right?
Yep. That's one. Yeah.
So I find it's in theory such a great idea, and it's this idea that we want to treat the person as a human being, and that we're starting to understand that pain is a little bit more complex. That's great, but I think a lot of the issues, as you bring up, is that we tend to sort of fragment the person into like three different buckets: bio, psycho, and social,
Yeah.
instead of doing what the model was intended to do, which is look at the person as a whole.
Yeah.
And in one of your papers, you write how a common pitfall of it is that when we tend not to be able to find a biological explanation for pain, perhaps in a phantom limb pain example,
Yeah.
we then end up bucketing the person into a more psychosocial category and then almost like blaming their brain or
Yeah.
blaming them and stigmatizing them. And that is not what the biopsychosocial model was meant to be. That's more so almost like what the biomedical model is we're still looking for this one reductionist source
Yep.
of person's pain, and then sort of like just having the simple A to B explanation to explain pain, which is a little bit too simple, right?
I think you put it so nicely, and I think it comes down in part to some of maybe the vague writing and like some of the limited theory in Engel's writing. So an example is one of his papers. He had this like vertical hierarchy where there's like these different kind of levels of these different systems, and it's like going from like society to the person with the experience down to the nervous system and down to molecules. And so people will go, oh, okay, well, we have the person with experience here, and we can actually make sense of that by just reducing it just to the nervous system or just to the brain. So pain is caused by the brain. And it's like, I don't think that's what George Engel was going for, though. He was talking about how at least he was kind of moving in the direction of all these things are always dynamically interacting. You can't just reduce it to only the bio. So you can't just follow his vertical hierarchy down. So as you nicely put it, we critiqued some of the interpretations, or maybe we call them misinterpretations
Right.
of his work. And also the buckets. Yeah, it's like the ICF is like a classic example where it's supposed to be grounded in the biopsychosocial model, but you kind of have these like different buckets where it's like a list of biofactors, a list of social factors, a list of psychological factors. And then people will tend to, at least the literature suggests this, and stuff that we've seen is like, well, yeah, we touched on those things, but I'm going to focus on the bucket that I'm most comfortable with, and also the factors in that bucket that is I'm most comfortable with, and largely disconnect them from these other factors. Tricky stuff.
Yeah. It's so tricky. It's so hard for us to think about these concepts. I think the human tendency is to simplify and to break things down into things that we understand, which is sort of what we're trying to get away from with these models.
I think that's like human nature, though. We put things into buckets to make sense of them, and it's like artificial domains. And I think the issue is when we start to forget that like these are just like artificially created. They're actually connected and intimately tied together, but we just made it kind of clunky to try to make better sense of these things, and we forget that sometimes. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm just gonna pull up a quote quickly before we move on to the next topic that sort of ties what we're speaking about together. You included a quote by the great Dr. Robert Sapolsky, a stress biologist.
Mm-hmm.
So let me find it quickly. So boundaries between different categories are often arbitrary, but once some arbitrary boundary exists, we forget that it is arbitrary and get way too impressed with its importance. And I think we can talk about that when it comes to the biological or the psycho or the social, but we could also talk about just different sort of body parts as well. And I think Dr. Sapolsky has the luxury of studying stress,
Yeah.
which impacts everything. So he's, I think, fortunate to understand how things are a little bit more complicated and how a stressful environment can influence things sort of internally within us,
Yep.
and how that could influence our cognition or our pain, etc.
Yep.
So the thing about the biopsychosocial model is that it doesn't talk too much all the time about our actual environment, right?
Yeah, and I think, to be fair, I think it does, but it's like And I think it's a really great start. And I think I regret, like I had a paper with Catherine Harmon in 2019 that was like beyond the biopsychosocial model. And it's like, and people thought that I meant I was like, we're throwing away the biopsychosocial model. I'm like, no, no. And so like in retrospect, I probably should have called it building on the biopsychosocial model
Mm,
instead of beyond, like, because it's like working with Ingalls' foundation, but adding some nuance, adding some theory, because he did kind of have these kind of like, it's like separate layers, and one of those layers was like society, the environment, the biosphere, as he called it.
mm.
But there just wasn't like as much connection and dynamic interaction appreciated. But for the time, it was like really great thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, very fair. And again, I think most of the issues are with misinterpretations of it.
Yeah, and I think it's and that comes from a bit of the vagueness too. So it's like it's a problem with the model in itself, but also in the application. So and those two are tied, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so let's build upon it.
Yeah.
Uh, you build upon it with the enactive approach to pain. And it could be a little bit tricky at first. So could you try to explain it sort of in simple terms for clinicians and even maybe a patient to understand?
Yeah, I think it's like, yeah, I guess it's like technical philosophical theory. So I wouldn't explain it to a patient, or maybe there is situations where that would be helpful, but like I think more so for clinicians, like I think maybe knowing a bit more about the theory might be helpful in guiding how they interact with patients. So in really kind of broad strokes, it is like a quite popular theoretical framework to understand experience. It's been around since the 90s, and the foundations before that go back over a century. And people have been applying it to a variety of different topics over the last 30 years, and only more recently applying this theory to the pain experience. So I've been involved in that work, but also other people. But yeah, right from the start, and activists say like we shouldn't be splitting things up into these kind of separate buckets. They make that quite clear. They say that experience comes from a person's interaction with their environment, and there's always these many kind of dynamic factors interacting and shaping the experience. And what's quite interesting is an activist like quite strongly reject this idea that pain is just simply, or any experience is just simply in the head or simply caused by the brain. So it really
Mm,
starts to conflict with kind of like the popular mantras that you hear in some clinics and some pain courses. So instead, I think they take quite an intuitive approach, pretty common sense. It's like, yeah, the whole body and movement shape experience, but that body is also always in a physical and social environment, and that also shapes the experience. So it is a bit of a, like I think I already said this, like common sense, but it is a bit more comprehensive and a more dynamic view than that kind of like more kind of clunky biopsychosocial approach. Yeah.
right, right. So I maybe it would be helpful to talk about like a pain example and
Yeah.
how we would sort of look at maybe back pain or maybe even phantom limb pain, whichever one you want to go with under the inactive approach.
Yeah. I guess a lot of people want to know that like how is this different from like what we're already doing, or how is it different from like the biopsychosocial approach. And like
Mm-hmm.
I use, because they're like, and people are even like, what is even this term, like what does it even mean, like. And I think if we start to break it down, it starts to make a bit more sense. So like the word inactive, or in the literature you also see inaction. So that contains the word active and action. So that's a really key difference, is that the inactive approach has this kind of strong focus on movement, and
Mm,
that isn't actually in George Ingalls' model as explicitly. So specifically, an activist focus on how we learn and perceive through movement. And I think this is why a lot of physios already connect with this theory, because they're already actually employing these principles on a daily basis, whether they call it this or call it something else. So really, a kind of main goal of enactive therapies, whether that's working with low back pain or other conditions, is really to find ways to help a person navigate their environment, navigate their daily life as comfortably and as seamless as possible, so they can engage in their valued activities. And I think that's what a lot of people in the rehab professions are already doing. But what I do think enactivism does offer, if we get a bit more deeper into the weeds, is it offers a more kind of fine-grained theory and also very specific concepts that help us avoid splitting things up into those buckets, or a tendency to just focus on certain buckets. So an example is like, I'll pick an easy one that we've written about, is like affordances. So that's a quite well-established concept that's often in enactive frameworks. And using that concept makes it pretty much impossible to silo people into these different buckets, or to only focus on one. Concepts like that force us to think about the person and their relation to their environment. So it drives people to actually consider a bigger picture. So whether that's back pain or something else, to consider what environment are they in, what messages are they receiving from other healthcare practitioners, what are their understandings of pain, how can they actually move and interact in their environment, what are the things moving against them, constraining them. So it's a bigger picture approach. Yeah.
Could you explain what you mean by affordances?
Yeah. So it stems from ecological psychology, specifically James Gibson. And it's, simply put, it's perceived opportunities for action. For example, for a human with a particular type of anatomy, particular body, in certain types of, with certain norms, a chair is perceived as sittable, where for a snake or another creature with different anatomy, different concerns, would see it differently or perceive it differently, as maybe a place to hide rather than to sit. So what's interesting is that these affordances are shaped by like the person's factors, like the body, anatomy, their existential concerns, their lifestyle, but also the environmental factors, features in the environment. But then there's also the relation between the two, the person and the environment. So this concept cuts across the person, the environment, person's history, their concerns. And so it really forces us to consider all these things in kind of a bigger picture. So that's just one example of a concept, one of probably over 100 concepts in enactivism that clinicians potentially can use in different ways. And I think that's what's exciting about enactivism, is there's just so many concepts, so much theory that people can draw from. So there's a whole life of literature that potentially could be read. So lots to navigate.
And there's lots of really cool examples that you bring up in your paper to sort of help just describe what enactivism is. And I think some good examples of how movement can influence perception, along with how our environment can do that, and sort of the interplay. Some examples that you speak about are from other studies, where if people spread their arms out wide and they're looking at a doorway, they may interpret that doorway as actually being a little bit more narrow. But that doesn't happen without the movement of spreading the arms wide, but that also doesn't happen with perceiving this doorway in front of you. Without the two, then that sort of I guess appraisal of your environment doesn't really make sense. You also bring up examples of people standing at the top of hills, either on a skateboard or on a box, and they'll actually interpret the hill as being steeper when they're on the skateboard, because maybe there's a little bit of fear involved. And there's examples that you discuss with actual pain as well, where people with low back pain, when they're lifting things, if they could actually envision them having a strong back, then that task is maybe perceived as a little bit less painful. So it's sort of how movement and our environment, there's this interplay between the two, and I find it so fascinating.
I love that you find it interesting, because that's what hooked me into enactivism first. So enactivism is grounded in something called embodied cognition, which is related to all those examples that you just gave. And it was through embodied cognition that led me to an enactive theory. And I was like, how is this possible? It's like, okay, two people can look at the exact same environment and have completely different perceptions of it. And it's like, well, why is that? And it's like, well, maybe it's an adaptive thing. It helps people flexibly engage with their environment. So if I'm really tired and fatigued, like seeing a hill as steeper, like potentially could prevent me from climbing it to conserve energy, which could be adaptive. But where we start to run into issues is like with chronic pain, where maybe we start to get stuck seeing the world and ourselves in certain ways that maybe is no longer as helpful. Or maybe we're in an environment that's just maybe not helpful. Maybe we need to change the environment, not necessarily the person. So yeah, interesting stuff to think about. Yeah.
Yeah. So then if we take that chronic pain approach, how may an inactive approach influence how a clinician actually practices?
Yeah. And I guess I maybe alluded to this a little bit, but I think like clinicians already naturally use this, or a lot of clinicians do. Like, I think, so I mentioned like the active element or that focus on action. I think that's naturally found in a lot of practices. So that active learning element is in graded exposure. It's in approaches like CFT, anything that's like helping try to create, I guess, like safe opportunities for patients to notice how their pain changes in different environments, or notice how pain changes with different movements, or even if they're in different emotional states or have a different attentional focus. So I guess where I think, like, if we get a bit more detailed, though, I think if clinicians know a bit more about the theory, they may actually be able to avoid some of the problems that we talked about, some of those kind of pitfalls. And over the years, I've talked to people where they said, like, hey, I thought I was taking a biopsychosocial approach, but then I realized after reading some of the enactive literature, like, I was just like so brain centric, so nervous system focused, and like I'm now more open to these other factors, or at least the interconnection with these other factors. And people have said things like, I was actually limiting, like through my pain explanations and the way I talked about pain, I was actually limiting people's understandings of their pain and of their body, but also limiting treatment options. If they had a bit more of a narrow understanding, they may have been shutting down opportunities for psychological referrals or psychological interventions, may have been shutting the door to self-management strategies. So a lot of people are saying it just opened up some options, which I think is helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think another option that it may open up is maybe sort of that environmental approach. And sort of as you've discussed, I keep on referencing your paper. I'm just going to pull up the title just so I can actually
So
tell everyone
awkward
what it's
for
called.
me, but yeah, thank you. I
Sorry.
appreciate it.
It's called an inactive approach to pain beyond the biopsychosocial model. What was I saying? Oh, right. So taking a little bit more of an environmental approach, and sort of, I guess, people have beliefs or perceptions about their environment based upon a myriad of things, including their pain. And if they are perceiving a set of stairs as dangerous, or as like that they're going to be painful, can we alter their environment or the task to help start to maybe change their beliefs about those things? Maybe could we find an easier set of stairs for them to do? And maybe they think at first that it would be painful to go on it, but they have a positive experience completing the task, and maybe that could sort of start to change their beliefs. So I think it's like the CFT, this cognitive functional therapy approach that can blend in nicely with enactivism.
Yeah,
What do
and
you think
I
about that?
fully agree. And I think like reading some of the CFT papers where they're like, oh, like the foundation is like a biopsychosocial framework, and I'm like, to me, it aligns nicely with enactive frameworks as well. Like, yeah, as you nicely put it. And I guess like there's also example like I think physios or people in the rehab professions like naturally change the environment to kind of change how people act, think, and feel. Like they do it in a variety of ways without even realizing it. But there's also like really extreme like inactive interventions where people have actually made rooms where it funnels people to behave and act in certain ways. And like it's quite expensive, obviously, and not even feasible, but it's like a way to kind of demonstrate how the environment drives how we think, act, and behave. And I guess a cheaper alternative, because if we can't just change the whole physical environment, is like VR, for example. VR as a way to change the environment to open up opportunities for action or change the way people move change the way they experience pain. And there's a lot more research using an enactive lens to develop VR interventions, and I think we'll see more of that stuff coming out in the coming years. Yeah,
That's fascinating. And I think people may think about that VR and they may now make the mistake of thinking like, oh, so it's a psychological approach, right? Like it's like,
yeah,
oh, so it was just in their brain the whole time. I'm gonna read one more quote, and it's not from you, right? It's you included someone else's, so don't be
good,
embarrassed.
good. Yeah, that's better. Yeah,
Yeah. So this was from Thompson's paper in 2014. You wrote, saying that pain is in the brain. Sorry, not you wrote, Thompson wrote, saying that pain is in the brain is like saying flight is in a bird's wings. A brain is needed to have pain, and wings are needed to fly. But to understand pain or flight, one needs to consider the whole picture and the relational nature between things like a person with a body and brain and their social and environmental context, or the bird in the atmosphere. So yes, a bird needs wings to fly, but there is no flight without an environment to fly in. And there's no flight without the bird itself and its motivation and desire to fly. And even that experience of flight is changed by the bird's environment and what it sees and what it feels. So I think when we're using VR to help with pain, it's not to say that, oh, there's just like this one-to-one relationship with pain is in the brain and we're going to solve it with VR. We're changing the person's environment so that their body and their perception and the environment could have this very complex interplay altogether to eventually change their experience of pain, right?
Love it. Yeah, yeah. And it's not even like, I'm not, when I think of VR, I'm not even thinking of just like more passive type of VR. I'm thinking of like interventions that involve bodily movement simultaneously interacting with this digital environment. So
Right.
I'm glad you brought up the Evan Thompson quote. So he was originally talking about that in the context of the mind, like using that analogy to understand the mind or experience. And then, yeah, we adapted it to bring pain in. Yeah, it's such a weird analogy, but I don't know. I like it.
I think it's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it really helps just people conceptualize these things a little bit easier. You sort of touched on this earlier, but you mentioned that you may not explain enactivism to patients.
Yeah.
Um, are there any contexts in where you think like patients could have a better experience with pain by understanding these concepts a little bit more, or do you think it's a little bit too difficult to help them see this perspective?
Yeah. Yeah, there may be certain contexts, but and it's kind of like the whole like explain pain movement where it's like you sitting down a person and like explaining the biopsychosocial model. Like there may be opportunities there to like help expand a person's understanding of pain or change their beliefs, which may in turn change behavior. But a lot of the enactive literature is more just like, no, just like do it. Like the clinicians act like show a person like through movement, through different activities, showing how pain can be modulated, showing how movement can be modulated. And that'll actually create openness to these new ideas where it's like, oh wow, pain changes when I'm in these different environments. Oh, it changes when I'm in different states. Oh, it changes when I have different focuses of attention. And I think you don't have to explain a theory or give it a name to deliver these principles, which I think is like, exciting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't think like I've never talked about like when I worked in clinical practice, I never talked about the biopsychosocial model or an activism or anything, but like these principles would like guide a lot of what I did. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's one thing to tell them that they can have a different experience. It's a very different thing to actually show them.
Exactly, and I think a lot of the literature and activism is about education. So there's been whole kind of books and papers written on this, how enactive theory can inform how we teach students, and not just like outside of healthcare, how it can actually help people with like math education or learning about space or all these different things like getting people moving and experiencing things can help them develop new understandings and better understand concepts. So it's very a practical action oriented approach rather than
Yeah.
just sitting somebody down. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's say you said that these sort of concepts really helped inform your practice, but not necessarily in the way where you would explain these concepts to somebody. Could you maybe chat about if you were working with someone with maybe back pain
Mm-hmm.
and maybe they had a lot of negative beliefs about their pain? How would you sort of approach that clinical encounter in an action oriented way?
Yeah, I guess like the starting point is always like listening and validating the person's experience as real, regardless of the assessment or imaging findings or anything. So I think that's like crucial. Like time and time again, like the qualitative literature says people feel like they're not believed, they feel stigmatized, they feel like the healthcare practitioner doesn't take them serious, and I think that's a crucial starting point. Um, and then over time, it's developing strategies together in terms of what they think is viable, what their goals are, what their options are. So it always look different, but there was always usually some sort of like active movement based intervention. So stuff that would look very similar to graded exposure. So challenging people in safe ways, so that they can actually experience success, to overcome challenges that they thought maybe weren't achievable, and nudging them towards the particular goals that they're interested in, whether that's going to work or playing sports. So really, I think it's like basic stuff, but I think it does deviate quite a bit from maybe some of the popular approaches that are more about like finding and fixing a specific anatomical feature, or the sit down the patient and teach them about pain, talk about the brain and neuroplasticity. It's more of like just get into doing these types of things and sprinkle in the verbal education as you go. Yeah.
Right, right. And even if someone maybe thought that the cure to pain was to get stronger, perhaps that could mimic or resemble that graded exposure approach that you just discussed, where someone's lifting weights and they're progressively getting more challenging over time. And in the clinician's mind, maybe that person's getting better just because they're getting stronger. But there's potentially other explanations. Like we're changing that person's whole experience, and maybe some beliefs were changed along the way. So I think it opens up like some more avenues for treatments, as you sort of discussed. Like now we don't need to just sit someone down and talk about why pain is in the brain, or we don't necessarily need to just like get their muscles stronger. It's
Yeah.
I think once we understand this sort of philosophy, it just helps us understand that this whole thing is a little bit more interrelated and complex, but at the same time it changes our treatment strategies in a way where it gives us freedom, and we're allowed to discuss with the patient what their goals are and use that to inform our treatment approach, instead
Yeah.
of being so unidimensional in sort of what we target from a rehab standpoint. So I think it's amazing.
I love it. Yeah, I think my favorite paper that I've ever wrote was my first paper, or maybe second paper. Nobody ever reads it, but it's like it's still, I think a lot of it's still relevant. It was called like, I think it was 2017, like contemporary biopsychosocial exercise prescription, and it was like challenging. Like at the time, like core stability was so like dominant, and people were like, "Oh, you need to do like these specific TA exercises or the big three," and I like challenged that. Like I was like, okay, well maybe people are getting better for other reasons, not just uh, increased motor control or the timing of certain muscles or strength or muscle thickness. And I was like, maybe there's these other contextual factors at play, like building confidence, the therapeutic relationship, expectations, beliefs. And at the time, people were like, "What are you talking about? This is like insane." But I think it's like now commonly talked about and like appreciated. But like at the time, I was like, "Oh, this is like totally like different than what I was taught, and very different than what people are saying we should do." But yeah, if you ever want to, I think I disagree with some of the wording. I talk about like exercise adherence, and like it's a bit problematic in some points, but I think the common messages I think are still hold today. But yeah, I wish more people would check that one out. Yeah.
You heard what Peter said, guys. Go check it out.
Yeah,
I'll read it too.
yeah, don't read the philosophy ones. This one's a bit more accessible. Yeah.
It's more of the clinical one, and I
Yeah.
think it's mostly clinicians that are listening to this one too. So
Yeah.
okay. So last question: what evolution do you foresee coming in terms of pain theories and how we conceptualize pain in perhaps the coming decades?
Yeah.
Is
Yeah,
this
I
it?
guess.
Have we made it?
Yeah, I wish. I guess like yeah, obvious stuff is like improved technologies like AI, of course, will help. I think in a variety of ways, but I think we'll also probably realize like the harms that come with technologies a bit more, specifically AI. So I think there's like this tendency where people think AI is like objective, but I think in reality it is actually just encoding the biases and values of certain groups. I think we'll see a rise in like problematic practices where AI is prioritized over the voices of people living with pain over qualitative data
Mm,
under this kind of like guise of objectivity. Um, Probably
hmm.
as more harms are documented, people will recognize this a bit more and be like, oh, we probably should do something about this. And then more discussions about bias and inequities perpetuated by AI, which is like, and now that I say this, yeah, now I'm saying this, it sounds like super pessimistic, but so don't get me wrong, there'll be advancements, but I think, yeah, I think we'll hit a wall at one point and just be like, oh, we did some really bad things. So I think people are
Mm.
maybe overly optimistic about the value of some AI technologies in pain research, but also in practice. So maybe we need to be a bit more critical at times. Yeah.
Interesting. So it would be again making the mistake of what we do when we misinterpret maybe the biopsychosocial model, which is just not considering the person as a whole. And now we're considering maybe more quantitative stuff from AI. But again, maybe that person's experience would be invalidated.
Yeah, and I think of like the push towards personalized or precision medicine, where people are putting like developing these algorithms, like collecting all this data, these data driven approaches, and then it's like, oh, it like spits out this prognosis, and like people are looking at a computer rather than talking to the person living with pain, and so like on this quest for personalized medicine, it can easily become depersonalized if we're not careful. Yeah.
Hmm. Very interesting. Well, time will tell, I guess. But if
Yeah, I
we,
hope I'm wrong. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Hopefully, you're wrong.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, any closing remarks that you'd like to make, Peter, to sort of tie a ribbon on this?
Um, I don't think so. I just want to say thank you so much. And like, I know when I first came across the stuff that you've been doing, like I saw some nice rants on like Instagram, and I was like, oh yes, and he's Canadian. I'm like, this is good. So I want to say thanks for the work that you're doing. And it's not always, it's like pushing against the grain sometimes in some ways, and maybe challenging some ideas and kind of established thought. And I think that's wonderful and great. And it's good to see the critical approaches. And so thank you so much for the stuff that you're doing. Yeah.
I appreciate that. I mean, it's much easier to film a 1 minute video on Instagram than it is to write some papers, but I appreciate it.
It's all got to roll. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. All right, Peter. Well, it was great chatting. Thank you so much for coming on. I hope everyone listening learned something and can sort of employ these models into how they practice and sort of start to think about things a little bit deeper and in a more interconnected way.
Awesome. Thank you.